blows to the head and brain health. And particularly for female athletes, we know that they have fewer pledged brain donors who are female, and we know there's this gap in medical research, oftentimes, and in medical care surrounding some of the biological differences between women and men. For example, there's differences in particular pharmaceutical drugs where women have been found to need 3 times the dose that men need to get the same therapeutic effect. Anesthesia, there's various areas where there are these differences, and yet so much of the scientific default is to look at male populations for research. And so we want to see the full spectrum of humanity and gender represented in the research, so we know if there are differences, how can we address those. And so that's, for me, it just felt like kind of a no-brainer, almost like recycling. You might as well do it. You're not, just make this little effort, and then something good can come out of it potentially. And then I also participate. They do a longitudinal study of brain health that has qualitative and quantitative components too, where you do a yearly assessment and you have to do some tests, like mental dexterity and ability, as well as reporting the more subjective things that you're feeling and your symptoms in terms of head injury effects. And so I do feel like I support whatever they're doing, and it would be very relevant to a lot of people that I know and love for us to be able to diagnose CTE or even a pre-CTE type state in living humans. And I think we will get there. So
I'm sure that the science is progressing quite a bit, and actually I've been meaning to sort of follow up with Dr. Raza about that. But you're educating people about CBD, and I know that there are concerns about the THC being traceable in the blood testing with certain types of CBD. I know that it's available without THC, with the THC completely extracted. But are you also educating high school coaches about the use of CBD to protect the young brains? Because I've heard some stories about how the earlier the concussive injuries begin, the more devastating it is later in life. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I think that's an important point. I haven't worked with any high school coaches specifically to my knowledge, other than maybe a couple of teammates who may also coach some high school rugby here and there. But I think it becomes a tricky subject because of the stigma of cannabis. Talking about even just CBD can be an area that people don't want to touch when it comes to minors. And so even though there are no laws prohibiting minors from using CBD, and children can have medical marijuana cards and they can use THC. But yeah, I think that's another area where there's a lot of opportunity for us as a society to gain health as we really create more mainstream awareness of the benefits of cannabis, of various components of cannabis. CBD is neuroprotective, but there are other cannabinoids that are as well, including THC to some extent. Researchers are still really tip of the iceberg on all of these things, but what we have seen so far and the lack of better options makes it seem like we really should be pursuing these avenues. The parents that I know that give CBD to their kids definitely feel the need to be discreet about it. There's judgment from people who don't know anything. And then there are legal issues. Especially in some of the states with very backward laws, we've seen cases of child protective services taking kids away from their parents who are giving them CBD for things like epilepsy. And, we see cannabis refugees, medical refugees, where families with minors with different medical conditions move to a state where there is medical cannabis or adult use, so that they can properly treat their kids. So, yeah, I think we have a little ways to go before coaches are able to talk to their players, underage players, about these resources, which I think, again, is very unfortunate and backwards, but it just really highlights the work that still has to be done in understanding cannabis is a medicine. This is not a street drug. This is a therapeutic herb. So, again, the educational piece is going to have to really spread into various corners of society before we see everyone getting the full benefits from it that they could.
It really punctuates the need for legalization at a federal level so that we can start to really remove the fear that surrounds it. And I think when that happens, it's going to really open up the doors for more research, for more acceptance, especially in sports and especially for the young people. And there's still a lot of controversy around whether or not THC is harmful to developing brains. And there have been a lot of contradictory studies. The ones that say that it is harmful were early studies, and they were likely using contaminated cannabis, which would be harmful to just about anyone. I mean, contaminated with pathogens like herbicides and pesticides and mold and all sorts of things that can damage the brain, essentially. So, yeah, we have a long way to go, and it's hard to remember that, especially if we're living in a state where we have access. And especially if we're not in the sports franchises, because, that testing is, that's so annoying. And I won't name any names, but I've met players who, know exactly when they're going to be tested, and they protect their brains ahead of time, and then they clean themselves out right before they're tested. And, but it's a shame that you have to go through those hoops just to protect yourself. But congratulations on all the work that you've done, and of course on all of your amazing achievements. I know that you were a U.S. Rugby Divisional National Champion in 2014. That must have felt great.
Yeah.
Are you still active?
Yes, I'm still playing.
Tell me a little bit about your career. And you obviously started when you were very young in order to reach the level that you are now. But tell me a little bit about it.
Well, I started playing when I was 19. That's fairly young. But I'd played soccer my whole life. And I was in college. I transferred schools. I was playing for the team there. I'd just started to, but I wasn't having a very positive experience. And I was hanging out with a lot of the rugby players, and they were so much fun. And they eventually got me to just try a little bit of rugby, which was like tackling each other in the snow. And after that, I was kind of like, ooh, I think this actually just suits me a lot more. Where has this been my whole life? The contact. And then, of course, once I started playing, there was just no going back. I was absolutely in love with it. But rugby in the U.S. is very much an emerging sport. So in other nations and other places in the world, it's a huge cultural touchstone and or an industry. And, less so in the U.S. We've really had to, I don't think I've been asked for a while, they'll say, oh, rugby, is that the one with sticks? But, that's what it used to be. People didn't really know what it was. And I think awareness has grown because the sport has grown tremendously at every level, including at the grassroots level. So now there's youth rugby here, which we as a nation, if we're going to be competitive at a global level, that's what we need. We need people to start playing when they're kids to develop the skills they need so that by the time that they're 18, 19, they could be a professional rather than just starting to learn the game. And we're seeing that. We're seeing much more grassroots rugby, youth rugby, high school rugby, and collegiate rugby, programs where women can get scholarships. Men as well, but it was especially exciting for us as women. I think later in my college career, there were a couple of schools that had started to offer scholarships for players, and we would talk about that so enviously. Like, like, wow, wouldn't that be nice? um, and that was a little bit on the late side for me to participate in. But at the same time, it's really exciting to be in this cadre of players that's laying the groundwork for, that has helped grow rugby in America, and specifically women's rugby, that we as a group are advancing this sport that we love so much and feel so passionately about. And so I played a season overseas in Australia, in Sydney, which was really phenomenal and made some lifetime friendships there. And when I moved to Oregon after college, I started playing for our team here, ORSU. The Women's Premier League didn't exist at the time. It was just Division I was the highest level. And as we started to advance our game, we were participating at nationals. We were progressing in our outcomes. And then, so when the Women's Premier League formed 11 years ago, we were invited to be one of the founding teams. And the growth has been incremental. It's been there. But we have seen things like, rugby became an Olympic sport, specifically sevens rugby, which is a variation of the game. One that I also play. I love, for us here it's in the summer, and I definitely love sevens. But that is the version that made it into the Olympics. And a key component of that was the women's game. Rugby was rejected the first time around because they didn't feel like there was enough parity or enough effort going towards the women's side. And the Olympics is very strict about that, which is awesome, because what it forced World Rugby to do was, which is the governing organization, World Rugby had to invest more in the women's game and raise up the opportunities. And so with advocacy coming from all across the game, including the women's side of things, rugby made it into the Olympics. And then we were able to have, for a handful of players, professional contracts to train full-time down at the it was called the Olympic Training Center. Now the name's changed, but down in Chula Vista, our sevens teams train there for rugby. And so for women to actually get these contracts was a huge deal. And for men too. But, now we see Australia has professionalized their top league. And England there to some extent as well. It's still only a small number of sevens players that have those national contracts, but it seems like those opportunities are growing. And men's rugby in the U.S. just professionalized a couple years ago with Major League Rugby. And so we know that where they go, we won't be too far behind, hopefully. So it's, even though I won't necessarily still be playing, to have these opportunities in the same way as the younger players, I'm honored to be a part of creating those opportunities, and all that means for women's rugby players, for rugby as a sport, and then of course with my other passion for cannabis, I want to use my knowledge of that world, of the science, to help my people, the rugby players, as well as all athletes. Really, I think that there's so much potential. We love sports for a reason. It gives us an outlet for energy, for creativity, for self-expression, for teamwork, to display our character, to develop our character. There's so many different aspects of it. And yet we take a lot of risks, especially in contact sports, and especially with our brains. Our bodies can get very injured, but the brain is its own beast when it comes to injuries. So I am excited to see where it's going to go, and I'm really keen to be a part of helping advance all of those things together.
Well, the work that you're doing is amazing in that regard, and it is so important. But back to what you said about rugby being an emerging sport in the U.S., in Europe and other parts of the world,